Okay, great. Thank you so much. All right,
Mhm. Mhm.
everyone, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Maria Esther Hammack. Hey, Liz, can you mute yourself? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Not for me.
All right, thank you. Dr. Maria Esther Hammack is a Mexican scholar whose work bridges the histories of liberation and abolition that shaped the US, Mexico, and Canada in tandem. Her first book, Channels of Liberation, Freedom Fighters in the Age of Abolitions, currently under consideration with Penn Press, reconsiders the Underground Railroad to broaden the actors, timelines, and geographies of Black liberation in North America. Principally, it centers the experiences, physical journeys, and the legal and intellectual contributions of Black Americans who left the United States to claim freedom in Mexican spaces, inclusive of those whose efforts and claims were unsuccessful. This study, furthermore, integrates Mexicans, importantly, Black Mexicans, as abolitionists in order to reassess their long overlooked roles within the continental and transatlantic stories of abolition. Maria is an assistant professor of African American history at the Ohio State University. She is also currently a principal investigator of a humanities and place grant from the Mellon Foundation that aims to help in the recovery and preservation of transnational stories of liberation. Wow. Your work is amazing. So thank you so much for being here. And the floor is yours, Dr. Hammack.
Thank you so much. And please call me Maria. It really is an honor to be here with all of you. And so thank you so much, Wendy, for this invitation. And I know that, I was invited before and things happened and I couldn't make it last fall, but I'm really excited to be here and to share some of the work that I've been doing for the past, it seems like forever, but at least for the past 6 years, right? Um, and to start, sorry, I just admitted somebody else. To start, I just want to say that this research and the work that I do is anchored in a desire to bridge histories that have long been disconnected for long been disconnected from each other, um, in hopes that, learning and teaching about these histories will help us conceive solutions to many of the pressing issues that we have are facing today. Um, Particularly, not only border issues, but the erasure of many of our shared histories, among many other things that remain, that were and continue to remain relevant to all of us across the borderlands in Mexico and the US, Black, Brown, and Indigenous histories. So I'll start with a question for all of you, which I'm sure all of you have heard about this. Have you all heard about the Underground Railroad and Harriet Tubman? Yes, wonderful. Well, today I hope that I share some of the stories um, and learn about some freedom fighters that, like Harriet Tubman, merit further recognition and reintroduction, if you will, into the narratives that shape processes of freedom and Black liberation in the Americas. And we will add a few more names to the list of Harriet Tubman, and names of women, particularly, who were, as I argue, freedom fighters as well. I will break down this presentation in three parts, sort of. I'll start by telling you briefly about the work that I do to offer you an overview of how I conceived this work, what I've done to do some research on this. Then I will highlight some of the processes of freedom that I was talking about that shaped early Mexico, that empowered Black liberation in Mexico, but also who shaped these processes within that geography. I will also share a few stories of Black women who I situate, as I mentioned briefly, as freedom fighters, including one sorry, let me admit someone else. one woman who might be very close to your stories of in Brackettville, Brackettville and the Mascogos in Mexico, and that I recovered from some of the archives that I visited. So broadly, I study, as Wendy mentioned, Black liberation in North America, and the goal of the work that I do is to reconsider the histories of freedom making, freedom claiming, and importantly, freedom fighting. I revisit the ways in which freedom was produced to recenter the historical actors who engineered it, those who fought for it, those who died for it, those who tried and failed, those who tried and succeeded time and time again. My research does seek to help broaden the geographies and the actors who produce Black liberation in and for the Americas, but particularly through this talk for North America. And a note on freedom fighters that I do want to situate this is I situate individuals not as fugitives or runaways or freedom seekers, but as freedom fighters. And I argue this because I've considered a lot the language of fugitivity and how this language of fugitivity or even runaways is very much anchored in that system that turned human beings into chattel, into property. And this was a system that refused human beings the unalienable rights of freedom and legally declared those who pursued freedom and those who pursued those rights as fugitives or as runaways from the law, as absconders, among other names that people who pursued freedom were referred to as. So additionally, the records that I found in Mexico and the US and Canada, for that matter, showcase clearly that people were more than freedom seekers. They sought more than that. They were more than that. And I argue that, seeking implies something that may not be attained, this circular concept of like seeking and seeking, but you don't know if they were finding. And what I've noticed in the records that I found I think I've visited over 60 archives by now. And what I've noticed is that people, when they reach Mexican spaces or Canadian spaces for that matter, people not only wanted to be free, they wanted to be able to purchase land. They wanted to be able to become citizens. They wanted to be able to create communities and forge new futures for them and for their children. So I argue they were fighting for much more than just freedom. They were fighting for a lot more. And you see that in the records. And one of the things that I've learned is that, as well, is that Black women Black women, men, and children were always key to crafting freedom, to claiming it, to engineering it, if you will. And they always had to fight for it and often ended up dying, pursuing that freedom. This also goes into the knowledge that freedom was never granted, gifted, or bestowed upon by any other entities, by laws or white abolitionists per se. Freedom had to be wrestled, fought for, secured, even in spaces that guaranteed freedom, because in the words of one of the scholars that I greatly admire, Erica Armstrong Dunbar, she says that freedom was always fragile. It was fragile in the US, as we all know. It was certainly fragile in Canadian spaces. And it was certainly also fragile in Mexican spaces. So with that said, I'll go into the next section of this talk. And to begin, I do want to also say that this work centers a diaspora that I argue began in the 18th century, an African diaspora that shaped Mexico deeply. But this diaspora is different from the first diaspora that shaped Mexico, the first diaspora that I argue began in 1519, when the first, at the era of this explorations, conquest, if you will, when Hernan Cortés arrived in Mexico and brought the first enslaved and free Black individuals onto Mexican spaces. And we all know, and well, you may or may not know, I didn't know this growing up, even though I was born and raised in Mexico, that Mexico was the second largest space under the Spanish. It was a colonized space, but it was Spanish Mexico, was the second largest space that received the second largest amount of people from various African countries during the transatlantic slave trade. So the first country that benefited the most was Brazil. The second next country that benefited after Brazil was Mexico. And so that is the first diaspora that I argue shaped Mexico. People being brought from African countries, being brought to be enslaved. And as soon as they set foot on Mexican soil, they began fighting for freedom. They began escaping. They began claiming freedom in the very many ways that they were able to since 1519. We have stories like Gaspar Yanga, who led a large group of people into the mountains and rebelled against enslavement, and they lived free. And later they were asked to help the government, and they were able to create treaties where their freedom was respected. And so like those stories, there's a lot more. And so so that's the first diaspora. But this diaspora is the second diaspora that I argue of individuals who were born enslaved across U.S. spaces, or across spaces that were quickly becoming the U.S. spaces, because I know there's a lot of the borders and frontiers experience a lot of change, a lot of shifts in governments. There was a lot of empires vying for lands from Florida to Texas, and it changed hands from the Spanish to French to British to the U.S. And so across these spaces, there were a lot of people that were held enslaved. But as long as people were held enslaved, they were escaping and trying to pursue freedom. And Mexican spaces were spaces where many of them were able to claim that freedom. And I wanted to share this visual timeline with you that you see on the screen. And this highlights important anti-slavery legislation and decrees that were issued across Mexico as early as, or that applied for Mexico, even in the time of when Mexico was under Spanish rule. You see 1789, you see 1810. 1810 is the beginning of this revolutionary period where Mexico was rebelling against Spain, trying to claim its independence. And you see one of the first decrees that was issued in Mexico was that the selling of men was against the claims of nature, and that slavery and all laws pertaining to slave acquisition, trafficking, and commerce are abolished in the entire nation, and that all men were entitled to their own liberty. So that was the first decree, but there were all other decrees that you see on the screen that were being passed throughout what I argue is the long 19th century. And a lot of these decrees, they had to be reissued by these leaders of independence. And what I argue is this: most of the fighting for independence was done by individuals who either had been born enslaved themselves, or whose parents had been born enslaved, or whose grandparents had been born enslaved. So a lot of these individuals who were fighting to see a Mexico free from Spain were Black and Indigenous people or mixed people that had a vested interest in abolishing not only the Spanish rule, but abolishing slavery throughout this new nation that they were fighting for. And you see here every person that came into the leadership of this independence movement kept reissuing abolitionist legislation. And of course, we get to 1829, where our first Black Mexican president, Vicente Guerrero, passed the abolition of slavery in 1829. And then, I argue that I'm always very proud now that I'm a U.S. citizen to say, we've had our first Black president here in the U.S., Barack Obama. But in Mexico, we had two Black presidents before 1860. So we had Vicente Guerrero and then Juan Alvarez in 1855. But I just wanted to show you this timeline so that you can get a visual of some of the key legislation that made Mexican freedom possible. And in a way, these legislations were produced, if you will, by Black Mexicans who were, fighting to not only make a new country, separate from Spain, but a new country where they could be free and their children could be free.
A high of 87 degrees Fahrenheit and a low of 59 degrees.
Oh, and I'm going to point out to this piece of legislation. There's two pieces of legislation. This one in 1821 right here. And sorry, let me see. Cancel. Okay. This piece of legislation right here in 1821, and you can read it on the screen, in 1822. Those two were very important pieces that were passed during this, as Mexico secured independence from Spain. You start seeing that the first thing on the books was to abolish the caste system that had been constructed under Spanish rule. And to do that, these leaders that were shaping these visions of a free Mexico, they wanted to make sure that no government document was to classify citizens by racial origin. And then if you read here, and thus every person living on Mexican territory was henceforth, since 1822, without distinction, a citizen, even on paper. And so this law, in addition to the one that was passed in the Plan de Iguala in 1821, really were laws that were produced in as a way to not erase, but to abolish the caste systems, the stratification of people under different castes that did not allow upward mobility and that really limited opportunities in this new nation. And while these two laws at that time were meant as abolitionist legislation, by the turn of the 20th century, these two laws created this furthering of erasure of Black Mexican people, because on paper, no one was legally allowed to put I'm Black or Indian or Indigenous or any other but Mexican. So in all of the censuses since 1822 and all of the records, there was only one spot for Mexican. And so that erased all the other racial origins. And so while these laws, like I mentioned, were meant to be abolitionist, by the 20th century, they became laws that perpetuated the erasure of Black Mexican people. Luckily, by 2015, we get our first new census in Mexico, where for the first time since 1822, people can self-identify as Black Mexican or Afro-Mexican or having African roots. And that is a win by the Black Mexican communities that push for the census to be changed in 2015. So now, as of 2020, the census of 2020 has official boxes where anyone can self-identify by racial origin. And hopefully this will last for all the future census that Mexico does or has in the future, now or in the future. And so I just wanted to give you that to point you, to give you sort of context into what shaped early freedom processes in Mexico and what allowed for people enslaved across US spaces to reach Mexican spaces and be able to claim their freedom. Okay, there we go. And one of the things that I want to highlight here is that through the research that I have done, beyond researching the legislation and the laws and who was fighting for freedom, what I have learned is that Black women were at the forefront of a lot of these journeys southward from the US to Mexico of this second diaspora. Let me admit. And just as much as Black men were. A lot of the times when we learn about these stories, we learn of, individuals, Black abolitionists or white abolitionists. We learn of William Lloyd Garrison. We learn of Frederick Douglass. We learn of William Still. But a lot of the times, the women's names are not necessarily being taught as often or as strong as those of men. And so we do have Sojourner Truth, we do have Harriet Tubman, but there were many, many others, thousands of others who did a lot of fighting and shaping freedom that we don't get to learn about. And so in the words of this scholar, Jennifer Morgan, who she offers this powerful quote that says that, in order find women in history, it requires a special reading that privileges utterances that are meant to be small and insignificant. Finding women requires a reading that rejects the notion that women were passive or unconscious observers of men's radical resistance. And so in following this powerful quote, I have made sure that when I'm in the archives, I'm looking for women. I'm trying to figure out where they were, what they were doing, how were they fighting for freedom, how they were shaping freedom processes. And I have learned is that contrary to history books that help us or that tell us that women escape bondage less than men, because I have read history books that have told me that, the records that I have found in Mexico, in the US, and in Canada clearly show women and show their stories. And what I've learned too is that when I found women, I have found children, and I have found the men, and I have found the families. So perhaps it is that when I'm out there doing research, I'm looking for women, or I'm keeping a wide eye for women. And perhaps that's why I've been able to find them. But sometimes when we're not looking for them, perhaps we don't. But I always advise that wherever you go, however you do research, genealogy, try to look for the women and you'll find them. And you'll find more than what you were looking for. And this record that I have here on the screen documents the pursuit of a Black woman who escaped her French enslaver in Louisiana and who took her 4-year-old son with her and made her way to Spanish or to Mexican San Antonio. So this was San Antonio under Spanish rule. To claim freedom there in the spring of 1789. So people were going and pursuing freedom not just in the 19th century, but even before in the 18th century. And I have found individuals reaching early Mexican spaces, such as San Antonio, as early as the 1760s. And so people were definitely understanding that they could be free in certain spaces. When this woman here, and this record is in French, but I'll tell you a little bit about her story. When she endeavored her pursuit to claim freedom on the 20th of May of 1789, she not only took her 4-year-old son, but also took another child, a 15-year-old boy named Buku. Perhaps, I'm not sure if Buku may have been her brother or cousin, but it does name his name there as well, the document. She also ensured to take 3 horses as well as other effects, which demonstrate how carefully this woman may have planned her escape. This record that you see there was received in early San Antonio in June of 1789, and although little else is known about this woman and the 2 children's whereabouts, or if they made it to San Antonio or not, I don't know. I have not been able to find or trace her story, if she did make it or not. All I know is that her former enslaver, from whom she escaped, sent a letter to San Antonio saying, hey, I think she's going there, and I need her to be returned if she reaches San Antonio. And while I have not been able to find much about this woman, I have found others who did make it to San Antonio and escaped Louisiana. Not long after that 1789 story, we have the story of Marie. Marie headed for early Mexico as well around the same time in the 1790s. And her pursuits and efforts to challenge slavery and escape proved very effective. Her story is one of an unyielding fight for freedom that covers several decades across these borderlands. Marie was born enslaved in a French household. As a young child, she was given to a young white French woman as part of her dowry. And when this white French woman got married, she took Marie with her to her new household. In that household, Marie experienced unbelievable violence, and I'm sure many more experiences that she never actually got the opportunity to tell, at least not on the papers that I've been able to find. But she does talk about the violence that she did experience at her enslaver's hands, her enslaver's husband's hands. And once the French woman died, it was then when Marie was by herself against this powerful Frenchman, and she decided to escape. Actually, before he actually, after her mistress passed away, she decided to escape. But not long after that, she escaped with several of her children. The records do show that she was pursued very violently for all the way, and I'm not sure, I think past the French Texas borderlands. I do know that she started with several of her daughters and a small child. She was intercepted, and at some point, I'm not really sure what happened to her daughters, but I do know that she made it to San Antonio, but her child was actually intercepted, taken away from her, and returned back to her enslaver. And somewhere along the way that happened, like where her child was taken away from her, and she was able to reach San Antonio. And while there is much that was not left in the records do document that she made it to San Antonio, and that by 1793 she was living there, and that she was free after petitioning for her freedom to the provincial governor of Texas at the time, who was Manuel Muñoz. And the provincial, there was a provincial governor, and then there was a military official, so Manuel Muñoz and Rafael Martinez Pacheco. She petitioned for her freedom, and she was able to claim it there. But Marie's fight did not only end, as I mentioned earlier. People were not just fighting for their freedom, they were fighting for so many other things. In this case, Marie's fight did not only entail that fight for freedom, hers truly was an odyssey. She fought for her freedom and she secured that, but then she continued fighting for the freedom of her small child, because she wanted to make sure that she joined him, that he joined her in freedom in San Antonio. And she fought for well over a decade to secure the freedom of her son, who had been intercepted and taken from her. Eventually, she was able to help secure his freedom, but she kept fighting from that early Mexican space in San Antonio to assist not only her son, but other family members who remain enslaved in Louisiana. She kept sending letters and telling them where to come, how to go, what journey to take so that they could join her in San Antonio. And her efforts were so persistent and effective that, as I mentioned, in 1807, her former enslaver, because she was so effective in not only securing her freedom and the freedom of her son, but also enticing other family members and friends to escape as well and go to San Antonio, her former enslaver filed a lawsuit against her. In his lawsuit, he claimed that Marie was actively encouraging others held enslaved by him, to abscond. He argued that the whole situation, which had by then been going on for about 15 years, was becoming detrimental to him and his health. Therefore, he demanded the authorities in early San Antonio to make her stop. And in this suit, the slaveholder said that he was begging to be assisted because Marie, by word of mouth and in writing, regularly was perverting all of his slaves to run away. So, and that's where I say, like, he's saying, he's arguing in his lawsuit that she's me los pervierte por palabras por escrito. So she was perverting them by word of mouth and in writing, which means that Marie could write as well. And a lot of the times we don't get rich documents like this, but she knew what she was doing, and she was doing it by word of mouth and in writing, as the lawsuit claims. And this man eventually lost the lawsuit, and Marie continued to fight for her freedom and the freedom of many others. And one of the last records I found in Guadalajara, Mexico, was from 1823. So remember, she escaped in 1790, made it to San Antonio. But in 1823, she finally assisted her brother in claiming his freedom. He made it to San Antonio, but then he didn't stay in San Antonio. He went all the way down to Guadalajara, and that's where he claimed his freedom. And so it is what I mentioned, that her story is an odyssey. It's definitely an odyssey, right? And so it spans many, many decades and many geographies as well. And this story of Marie and the ways in which she corrupted and enticed enslaved people to escape to Mexico brings me back to a key aspect that I have documented and in many ways that I have interrogated through my work. And this aspect is twofold. First, one of the questions that I always ask is, how did journeys to freedom to Mexican spaces actually materialized? And the second the second question I always ask is, who led these journeys to Mexican spaces? Who was or were part of these networks? And what I found has been both enlightening and certainly not surprising. But, as we think about the Underground Railroad, we think of something very specific, because in American history, the Underground Railroad means these journeys north to Canadian spaces or to northern spaces. But what I try to do with this work is to reconceptualize this Underground Railroad to broaden the geographies of liberation and the actors who pushed for these journeys to expand, to go in other directions, that not just north. And so what I have found is the networks of assistance, I'll start with that I have documented are quite diverse. A pool of individuals and groups did a lot of the helping. Mexican people were certainly known to assist, both in the US and in Mexico. Sometimes Mexicans served as guides to help people across the Rio Grande or across the Gulf in vessels. At other times, local Mexicans offered assistance in the form of providing food or raising money for other people who arrived on Mexican soil, with often nothing but a few clothes. And this document right here in the middle is basically tells of a few individuals in Coahuila gathered 246 pesos to give to a few individuals who had just arrived from the US pursuing freedom, and who just arrived with nothing. They didn't even have food, and so they collected $246 to allow them to have food and shoes and clothing, but also to allow them to continue on their journey, because a lot of them didn't want to stay on the frontier. They wanted to keep going where they could not be pursued further. And so Native people were also known to participate in helping in these journeys, or facilitating these journeys. As you see here, some individuals, oh, sorry, my screen got, my screen went to sleep, and sometimes that happens, but there we go. This record right here that you see is showcases that Indigenous people were also very much part of these assistance networks. Either sometimes Indigenous people were actively assisting by forging, like as you see here, this Choctaw individual was arrested for writing passes, and also he was charged for stealing individuals from slavery. But there were people that I found in Indigenous communities who were actually assisting them to freedom, or at least if they were not actively assisting them, they were allowing them safe passage through Native communities. And we see here as well that there were multiple people that did a lot of the helping. But it is also very important to highlight here, and I always like to do this because I've also understand that this history is very complex. And I say this because I have found in the research that I have done that both there had been both Indigenous people and Mexican people who were doing the opposite of helping. They were serving as slave hunters, and I've come across documentation that says that as well. And I've also found Indigenous people also acting as slave hunters, or returning people. Instead of assisting them to freedom in Mexico, they were returning them back to their enslavers. So it's important to acknowledge that while a lot of these communities did a lot of the helping, they also served to do the opposite. So it is a complex history, and sometimes when you find those records, it's very hard to process, because these are also hard histories, but it's also important to acknowledge them. It is, however, very important to acknowledge that the majority of the people that were doing a lot of this work were Black women, men, and children. It were Black women, men, and children, enslaved and free, who were very actively engineering these networks to freedom to Mexican geographies. Or what could be conceived, if you will, or I argue, as underground railroads of sorts. Enslaved and free Black people were leading and very active in the pursuits, in their own pursuits, in the claiming and the fighting for freedom, and the many levels, at the many levels that freedom materialized in Mexican spaces and across the very dangerous U.S.-Mexico borderlands. So even though they were closer to freedom, if you think of the geographies of the borderlands, they were not easier. They were not easier than going to Canada. They were equally as dangerous, going north, south, east, or west. And while many people, particularly Black women, men, and children, were physically, as I will share a few stories before we conclude, endeavoring journeys to Mexican spaces, other people were intellectually forging and facilitating pathways to freedom. And I wanted to share this letter here because it is an example that allows you to see how Black women were intellectually shaping Mexican freedom, or at least shaping an aspect of Mexican freedom. This is a letter penned by an unnamed Black woman from Philadelphia. And it's unnamed because at this time it would have been very dangerous for someone to put their names and saying some of the things that she was saying here. So a lot of these are anonymous letters that were sent to abolitionist newspapers like The Liberator. And so this was in 1832. I believe that says us right at 1832. And she says, this woman wrote, voicing her support for envisioning Mexico as a destination where Black Americans needed to go. Mexico was the freedom destination, she argued, or at least she was certainly endorsing Mexico as the country where people could claim and live free. She wrote, and I'm just going to quote a section of this letter. She wrote, "Where is that country to which we may remove and thus become free and equal? I believe that country to be Mexico. Mexico," she argued, "was an independent nation where the prospects for Black people were far better. Whereas in this country," and I'm quoting what she says, "we are kept poor and of course cannot aspire to anything more than what we have always been." And these letters like this, and this is just one example because, we don't have all the time in the world, but this is one example that demonstrates that freedom in Mexico is undoubtedly shaped by Black Americans themselves, by Black women who were intellectually working and endeavoring to create this idea that in Mexico you could be free, to disseminate this idea that you could go to Mexico and you can live free and you can, have more than freedom. And so there were a lot of people intellectually shaping Mexican freedom from the US. And now I want to conclude by telling you briefly the stories of 3 women that I've been able to recover from the Mexican archive, Mexican archives and some US archives as well. The first story is of a woman named Matilda. And I guess I'll tell you more fully the story. Matilda was born enslaved in likely Louisiana. I'm not really sure exactly where she was born, but on August 20th of 1850, before August 20th, so she escaped her enslaver and went to Mexico. Well, I'm not really sure how long she had been gone, but she went to Mexico. She was able to claim freedom and live there. And so she had been living there for several years until, of course, her enslaver continued to pursue her because to him, she was worth a lot of money that he could not afford to lose. So he hired some slave hunters to, mind you, illegally cross into Mexico and look for her. He wanted to know exactly where she was so he can go and kidnap her and bring her back to U.S. slavery. And this plan was effective. One of the slave hunters was an Anglo from Texas, and the other was a Mexican slave hunter, and they were able to locate exactly where she was living in Tamaulipas, and he was able to know exactly where she was. So on the night of August 20th of 1850, He crossed the border illegally into Mexico. He went in pursuit exactly where the slave hunters had told him that she was. He broke in the middle of the night, broke into her home and tried to kidnap her. And she fought him with everything that she had. And you know that she fought him because these two documents, this is from one archive in Tamaulipas, and this is from one archive in Mexico City. And these records show that she started fighting him and beating him with everything she got. She started shouting at the top of her lungs for assistance, and assistance came. Her neighbors came to help her. One of them arrived with a gun, and together were able to stop the former enslaver from taking her back. And not only that, they were able to take him to the local jail where he remained for about 10 months without parole. And because of because of this, lodging him into jail, she had to give the testimony of what had happened, and that's why we have her record. And it's one of the most incredible records you could see, because it tells you exactly what had happened. She also had a young daughter, and for the longest time, the Mexican records didn't only mention her daughter as a child or as a girl. Or in Mexico, we has this phrase, una criatura, a little girl. And so nobody mentioned her name. But then I was not looking for her, but I was looking for something else in Texas. And I realized that her enslaver was, there were slave schedules in Texas, in the Texas census. And her enslaver had moved to Cameron County and had said that he had two slaves. Matilda, who was 26, and Harriet Ann, who was 6 by then, I guess, and that they were fugitives from him. And so that's how I was able to find her daughter's name. But this just one story of one woman who fought with everything she had. She was truly a freedom fighter, and she never returned to a slavery in the U.S. But this also showcases that slaveholders were willing to pursue people, even those that had already claimed freedom in Mexican spaces. And on September 4th of 1850, 4 days before the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act in the U.S., her former enslaver was officially charged for attempting kidnapping in Mexico. And it just goes to situate both the histories of both countries simultaneously, where in the US, the Fugitive Slave Act was being passed, but in Mexico, the opposite was going on during the same time. And so it's important to put a lot of these stories into context sometimes, but situating Black women's experiences front and center, like Matilda, who fought to remain, not just for her freedom, but she had to continue to fight to not be kidnapped after being free. Another woman that I want to mention very briefly, because I don't want to go over time, and I do want to conclude with one of the last woman, Sylvia Hector, and I do invite you, and I'll send Wendy the link, but this is a woman who, as Harriet Tubman, assisted countless of people to freedom, first from Central Texas, along the Colorado River in her ferry, and later from Hidalgo County, where she ferried people to freedom. She herself moved her and her young daughters to Mexico during the Civil War after her family were labeled Unionists. And of course, they were anti-slavery. One of her sons, well, two of her sons were working as spies for the Union. One of them was actually caught by the Confederates, and but he was able to escape. But they did a lot of work for the work on the borderlands to shape freedom processes. And a lot of their stories remain largely unknown, but I want you to at least know her name, Sylvia Hector Weber. And I'll give Wendy the link to her biography. And a lot of her descendants today are very active and in not only the recovery of their stories, but also in finding a lot more descendants in the US and in Mexico to be able to better preserve the history, but also preserve the cemetery that is right here in the border of Hidalgo County and Tamaulipas, which at some point was threatened for a moment by the border wall that was being built a few years ago. And I can tell you more about that in Q&A if we do have time, but if not, I invite you to learn more about her and read her biography. But I do want to conclude with this story of a woman named Becky Simmons. And Becky Simmons, I found a story that was collected by oh my God, of course, now I'm going to forget, but he's a phenomenal scholar who left a lot of his records to the Schomburg Center. And he did a lot of work on the Black Seminoles.
Is it
And
Kenneth Porter?
Kenneth Porter. Yeah, Kenneth Porter. Thank you, Wendy. I was like, why can I remember? And I've mined his records, his stories, because he was an incredible researcher, an incredible historian. And he took a lot of oral histories, which many of you may know. And this is one of the stories that is in his archives, and it caught my attention because seldom do we have stories of women in this context, but seldom do we hear the experiences of Black women crossing the Rio Grande as they were pursuing freedom in Mexico. And Becky Simmons was one of 700 individuals who crossed the Rio Grande to get to freedom on July 13th of 1850. And she crossed as a group of Black Seminoles people that were moving with Wildcat and John Horse. Wendy and you all know about this story more closely, and that's why I wanted to conclude with her, because this is a powerful excerpt of her experience. And she says, and I'll read it, we were glad that we were done, or get away from the American race people, and we felt that we could be safe if we can get across the river. Our men look around with Wildcat for a place to ford the river. It was dark and about the middle of the night, so that we had to be hurrying to get through with the crossing. But the hours looked like 10 years, for we were so close to the American race people that we wanted to get away across the river soon. Soon Wildcat said that he had found a good place, and we, the women and children, crossed first. Then the men crossed after us. There was a skiller made out of 3 logs tied together, and a skiller, and I realized there were different ways that people build vessels to cross the river. One was it's called a killer boat, which was a flat boat made of logs. And so when I said a skiller was that, and so I did some research, and it was just a flat boat made of logs tied together. And she says, which we crossed on. It was a good ride, for the men took long sticks to guide the traction across the river. And I think there's a second part that I didn't, but she does continue explaining, and I should have put it here, but she does continue explaining how they were scared at the beginning, but once they crossed over, the fears dissipated because they were now on the other side. And I've been researching more to try to find more about Becky Simmons. But I haven't been able to find a lot more on Becky Simmons. And I don't think Kenneth Porter was able to find a lot more either. But maybe I wanted to share this with you because maybe you all might be able to find her at some point in your own research. And hopefully you are able to find more at some point. But at least you have a little glimpse of her experience. And that I hope offers you some insight or window into the experiences of what it felt to cross the river in pursuit of freedom. And in closing, I'll leave you with this, that these stories are all of our stories collectively. And this bridge are collective past, Black, brown, Indigenous, and white. It's important to reclaim how foundational these stories are to better understanding freedom and liberation, justice, and our present. The lessons we can take can help us reconstruct new futures to challenge issues very relevant to all of us today. And one of the things I like to say is that the more we know about these stories and the more we know about these experiences can truly help us challenge anti-Blackness And I have lived, I grew up, was born and raised in Mexico, but I've also lived in Canada, and I've lived many years, most of my adult life in the United States. And I know that anti-Blackness is not just an issue that we have here in this country. Anti-Blackness is an issue that connects, unfortunately, the histories of Mexico, the US, and Canada together. And I think collectively we can find ways to challenge anti-Blackness throughout the North America. And hopefully knowing about these stories and disseminating them and hearing and teaching about them can help us a little bit to fight on that front and also fight erasure. And that's all I have. And thank you so much for being here. And if you have any questions, I'm very happy to answer them.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so let's open it up to questions. Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Maria?
As a matter of fact, yes. And I'll try to behave, Wendy. Believe me, I will. Well, first of all, Dr. Hammack, thank you for your presentation. It was wonderful. First question, I guess they're kind of related, but my eyesight's not what it used to be. But the document you have from Coahuila, what year was that? Do you know?
The last one?
Yeah, the one you had on the screen.
Okay, that one? Mm-hmm. It's July 13th, 1850.
1850. Oh, okay, interesting. That ties into my next question. I'm just curious, during the course of your research, did you have any, came across any record of any interaction between President Alvarez's administration and the Seminole community, either from with John Horse or somebody else that represented the communities in the Northeast?
I haven't found any instance where Alvarez had any communication. I do know that Alvarez was very much in tune with Juarez, who was and he himself, Alvarez and Juarez, spent time in New Orleans, and so they did a lot of their planning to come back and and take the government back from the Third Empire, which was, Maximilian and the French imposed empire. So a lot of that planning happened in New Orleans. So I have seen Alvarez there, but not in context with Black Seminoles. But that's something that I may try to find some answers for you.
Oh, well, I appreciate that regardless.
Hi, my name is Phyllis Grimes. Hi, doctor. How are you?
Hi, good. Call me Maria, please.
Maria, thank you so much. It was just a very informative, awesome presentation. My quick question, the last Becky Simmons, and I noticed the oral history was dated 1930. Was that part of the oral history here in the United States where they took for the former enslaved people, or was it her history?
So this was when Kenneth Porter interviewed her in Mexico.
Oh, in Mexico? Okay.
In 1930.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. Because I'm a genealogist, and sometimes people step out to me. She's stepping out to me to find more things about her. So I'm taking her with me.
Please do. And that may have been her maiden name, and then she got married, and so the Simmons name
She started here, so I can. I'll see if I can. Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I'll let you know what I find.
Please do.
Hello, Dr. Hammack. How are you?
Hello, good. Thank you.
Hi. Very informative presentation. Thank you so much for sharing such a wealth of knowledge, and your research is just stellar. Thank you so much.
And call me Maria. It's
okay. Thank you, Maria. I just have one question. Do you have any recollection of any particular musical selections or any type of authored works that reference any storytelling that seem to have African origin that we can find in Mexico that connects, Black Mexicans to, let's say, folks, that escaped from plantations in Georgia, South Carolina, or anywhere, in the Southeast? Are there any type of stories that seem similar, or any type of music or any type of songs that come to mind that seem familiar or that tie those places together?
So not that I have been able to recover myself in the research that I have done, but I do know that there are a lot of chants. I know that communities in El Nacimiento and even Bracketville, they do have a lot of chants in songs and stories in songs. I do know that Veracruz, communities in Veracruz also have them in some of their songs and their music. But I'm not an expert on that context, but I do know some scholars who have been doing work in music. I do know that there's a lot of musical connections and musicians that left places like New Orleans, for instance, and moved to Veracruz, like Edmond Dede, for instance, and the Tios, which was a family of musicians as well, clarinetists, I believe.
Yeah.
But that's just preliminary work that I've done, but I can get you some names of scholars who might be able to answer that question for you.
Thank you so much, Maria. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Dr. Maria, my name is Randall Factor. Thank you for your presentation. Hopefully, Miss Wendy can invite you back for another one soon.
Oh, I would love to.
All right. You born and grew up in Mexico and were educated at The Ohio State University. Is that correct?
Well, now I work at The Ohio State. But you didn't write that The Ohio State. They do the whole THE thing, you know?
Right. Now,
Yeah.
do you give presentations in Ohio or anything like that? Because I'm in Ohio, actually.
Oh, you're in Ohio. Where are you
Yes.
at?
I'm in Lima, Ohio. There is a satellite campus of the OSU here in Lima.
I'm in Columbus, so if you invite me, I'll go wherever you ask me to go. I would
All
love
right.
to share some of the work.
Fantastic. Thank you again.
No, thank you. And we're so close.
Yes, we are. All right.
Hi, Dr. Maria. I had a question. Hello. Let me actually put on my video. I just wanted to just thank you. Oops, it turned off. Thank you so much for the presentation. This is so phenomenal. I feel like there's this really beautiful renaissance going on of all these histories that have existed for such a long time that really look past that US-centric view that really minimizes all of our history to the African diaspora and our connections. Like you nailed it. Black, brown, indigenous, just this cultural just connections that we've all had. And I think it's going to just pave a way to give us more creativity to think of like ideas for the future to look past just these challenging times coming. I just wanted to know a bit more what really like led you on this path. Like how did that look for you to really hone in on I'm going to research just Afro-Mexican liberation and see how that's tied into just this again, just these stories of liberation that goes across borders. How did that start for you?
So I had two driving factors. So I'll tell you the first and I'll tell you the second. The first factor, I was born and raised in Mexico. As many people come to this country, I was undocumented for a long time. I ended up getting married, was able to get my papers. And as soon as I got my papers, I wanted to go to school. And at that time, I was working full time. And when I enrolled in at the local university, I was living I was in North Carolina because a lot of my cousins had made it to North Carolina in the early 90s. And so that's where I ended up in North Carolina. And I was in a small town called Greenville, North Carolina. And I started going to East Carolina University. And because I was working full time, I could only go to school in the evenings. And the only classes that were available from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. were the history classes. And one of my first history classes was taught by my first Black professor, David Denard. And he was talking about the history of the Old South. Mind you, growing up in Mexico, I really didn't learn anything about Harriet Tubman or anything about the Old South. But I did know that Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829. So when we got to the topic of the Underground Railroad and Harriet Tubman, I really wanted to know who the Harriet Tubmans who led people to Mexico were. And I asked him and I said, can you tell me, who was the Harriet Tubman who led people to Mexico and how many people went to Mexico? Because to me, it was just logical that if you were in places like Alabama, Mississippi, New Orleans, Louisiana, Texas, I was like, they could just go south. Why go all the way to the north to Canada when they could just go south? And I remember him looking at me and saying, that's a very good question, Maria. If you find out, let me know. And then I was like, wait, you're the professor. You should know these answers, right? And then every time that I passed by his office for about a year, he kept asking me, what have I found? And at that time, I was actually doing a research project, trying to figure out, to learn more about indigenous populations who had been displaced from Mexico and had made it to the US because of the NAFTA agreement and all the displacement that NAFTA caused. And then at some point, when he kept asking me what I had found, it just made it very pressing for me. And this is why it made it very pressing that I actually started looking for the answers, because I found that he was right. I needed to find the answers to do something that it was relevant to my story, to Mexico. I grew up in Mexico, in a Mexico that actively ignored its Black roots, its anything to do with its African history or Afro-Mexican history. We don't learn it in Mexico. Nothing is learned. And so when I started doing this research, it really became a priority for me to find more histories, to challenge those erasures that I grew up not learning, to challenge the erasures that I faced in Mexico, down to the point that even when we learned about Vicente Guerrero, he was always situated as a mixed or even a white man. Because that's how Mexican history books used to teach him, as that he was just, and even the paintings were whitened, right? And a lot of these histories, how I learned them or I didn't learn them, really bothered me. And I think that for me, it was very important to do this work, not only for the US audiences, but particularly for Mexican audiences who continue to erase Black histories, our Black roots, even within our families. And, if you know anything about Mexican um, ideologies, racist ideologies that really go down to individuals such as Vasconcelos, racism is very ingrained, and not just anti-Blackness, but anti-indigeneity as well. And even in our own families, when we try to challenge where we come from, or like, hey, have you looked into our lineage? We do have this, these lineages, and your own family members argue and say, no, 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 we don't have indigenous or Black roots. And then they bring out the proverbial French ancestor or Spanish ancestor. And those type of things really bothered me, that erasure and that anti-Blackness. And I think that is also what has driven this work. In addition to me wanting to find answers, I do want to see change in Mexico. And you see change already happening because of Black Mexican communities being very active in bringing that change forward.
Maria.
Thank you, and good work again.
Maria,
Thank you.
the white settlers that settled in Mexico, that came to Mexico, they had some certain provisions that they had to become Catholic, correct? And they had to abolish slavery. They couldn't come there if they had. So those white settlers brought that same mentality, to Mexico. So that's what I thought. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
so can you talk about the discrimination and prejudice that went on in Mexico against Black African Americans at that time?
Yeah. So their experiences in Mexico, particularly, and I think you're talking about like white settlers that settled in Texas, like the
Yes,
Revolutionary period.
Yes.
And that really caused a lot of issues for not just Mexico as a whole, but for the revolutionaries like Guerrero, who had fought a whole war, Afro-Mexican, revolutionaries who have fought a war against Spain to have a free Mexico.
Right,
It caused a lot of issues because here were these new settlers coming, Anglo settlers, bringing in enslaved people, and then saying, complaining about Mexico abolishing slavery. And they were constantly going to the Mexican Congress, particularly Stephen Austin, going into the Congress and saying, you can't abolish slavery because we can't afford to lose all this property. And so this is one of the things that I argue was a mistake of Guerrero. He understood that he couldn't afford a war in his hands. So when he passed the decree abolishing slavery in 1829, because of Austin's constant badgering, and actually he went down to Mexico to the Congress to try to change their minds, and he didn't want a war. So what Guerrero did, he passed the decree abolishing slavery on September 15th of 1829. By that December, Guerrero chose to give the Texas settlers, the slaveholders in Texas, an exception to the law. And it only applied to Texas, but basically said we're allowed you to keep those slaves for 10 years. But he gave them stipulations, and he said that among the stipulations was you're not allowed, everyone who's born of the people that you already hold enslaved are born free. You are to educate them. The slave trade is, you cannot bring any more people enslaved into the country. And so the stipulations were hefty, but he did give them an exception. Now, that exception did not prevent the Anglo settlers from rebelling against Mexico, because they didn't want to, even with the exceptions, they did not want to abide by the abolition laws. And so a war still happened, the rebellion still continued. And what the government did at the end in 1837, they said, oh, okay, even when we made concessions for you as Anglo settlers, you decide to continue to rebel. So now what we're going to do is we're going to reissue the abolition of slavery law. And they did in 1837, but the reissue had another clause that said, from this reissuing of the abolitionist law include a clause that says no exceptions, because they had given an exception to the slaveholders in Texas in 1829, but now in 1837, they were no longer willing to give them any exceptions. And of course, by 1837, Texas claimed independence, even though Mexico did not recognize that independence until 1844, right before annexation. And so it did complicate these notions of freedom in Mexico. And it really made leaders like Guerrero appear lukewarm on abolition. And it didn't do any service to the freedom processes that they were professing to stand for by giving an exception to slaveholders.
Right.
And appeasing people never works, as we learned later in World War II, right? They shouldn't have done it, but they thought that, if they just give them an exception, the rebellion wouldn't happen. But we know that that's not what happened.
Thank you. That was great. Yeah.
Thank you. No, excellent questions. And I could talk for hours, so.
Well, what I'd like to say is continue to tell this story, Maria. This is a really important story, just like the story of the Seminole Scouts, which, Wendy, I love you guys for really keeping that story alive. This story needs to be told. A lot of people, including a lot of Black people, really don't know that they too have roots in Mexico, or that there is a connection there. And I'm speaking Paulette and Miss Phyllis here. Genealogists need to be thinking that way too, because many of us who are doing Black genealogy don't think to look to Mexico for potential roots. So yeah, continue to tell this story, because people need to understand how prevalent it really was.
Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret. Go ahead. I was going to say real quick, this is Phyllis, to Margaret, DNA. I have looked at my DNA, and if you have taken the DNA test, if you do a search, just do a search on a country, you'll find your Mexican people. They'll be popping up. So that is so true.
That's right.
Yeah. But people need to ask that question. So that's
Yeah.
Maria,
Great, if you have it,
Maria,
you gotta go to
Maria,
ask.
Maria, do you recommend? I have the book South to America by Imani Perry, which I've read,
Mhm.
and I've also got South to Freedom. So I'm very
Mhm.
familiar with that by Baumgartner. Do you recommend those
Mhm.
books? You
I
do?
do. I do. They have done a lot of work to open a lot of undertold stories that we need to know.
Yes. Yeah.
And they're important works. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, and Wendy can share. I have a piece coming that is going to be
Yes.
published next month, but she can share it with you all, so you can read about.
Oh,
I
good.
talk
Yeah,
about two women.
so anyone who wants it, if you want to put your email address in the chat,
Okay.
and I'll share it with y'all.
Okay.
All right.
And that highlights the story of one woman from Houston who led the Underground Railroad south, and another woman from Brownsville, who was very active in helping others.
I think it got quiet while everyone's putting their emails in the chat.
So this is Phyllis. Real quick question. Now that I'm on DNA, that is my field in case you all want to know why I keep sticking with the genealogy DNA especially. Are people taking a lot of DNA tests there in Mexico? Is it kind of prevalent, or how's DNA going there? I don't have a lot of insight on that. I do have a little bit, but share with me, please.
So, as a Mexican, I would say that people are very feel very strongly against DNA, and mostly because in Mexico people think it's scams and they just want to steal your information. But I know there's use. I haven't taken one, but I have a lot of people. I know a lot of people that have, and they still. Some people are like, yes, you need to take it, and other people are like, well, no, but they do. I heard this whole thing of 23andMe that they were trying to sell the company to a healthcare,
Well, yes, that's
So I don't know if
another.
what's true.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if Ancestry, I don't know if Ancestry is in Mexico, because a lot of them are just here in the United States. But the reason I asked that, because I know as far as DNA Native American, sometimes it's a cultural thing where they're not a lot of people participating. But I was just kind of wondering about Mexico, because if people get to, especially the African diaspora there, you're going to find these, they're just going to pop up, and you're going to connect with your families quicker if that DNA is being done in Mexico as well as here.
Yeah. And I think that's a problem, because I think people are distrust those DNA companies, and I think that's why it hasn't taken off in Mexico as I've seen it taken off in the US. But it's a good tool. And maybe we could take a trip and tell people down there that
I'm with you on there. I'm with you on there, because that I use that to not break brick walls, but that helps. It like puts your relatives in your lap per se, because everybody, even your enslaved relatives, because if you take the DNA test, as you know, they're going to pop up. DNA does not lie. What people think it does, we do, but DNA does not. So anyway, I was just wondering about that. That would be a good idea.
Yeah. And there's still a lot of people that don't have access to their own records. Like, I recently came across, found for the first time, my great grandmother's birth record. She's lived her whole life never having seen her birth record. Wow. Because they were poor, they lived in a remote area, and they just and I was able to find it because the Mexican that particular space, that little ranch vicinity where she was born, was recently digitized by the Mormon projects. The Mormon had this huge database, and that's the only reason why I found them. But beyond that, a lot of people don't, especially elders, grandparents, great grandparents, they never perhaps haven't seen their own birth records, let alone other records. But there's a lot of work to do in Mexico too. That's the truth.
Okay.
All right, it's about 9:20. Do we have any other last questions for Maria?
And you can always email me as well. Anytime, please feel free to share my email, Wendy.
Yes, I will. Let me put it in the chat real quick.
And you should put a link to the biography to my website so you can
Yeah.
read some of the
Yes.
little blogs,
Okay, cool. I will do
including
that.
Sylvia's biography.
Okay. I'm having slight technical difficulties, but here it goes. All right, so here is your email. And then I have your website here. All right. And there it is. This has been an amazing, amazing presentation. Thank you so much to everyone who came on. Y'all enhanced it by your questions. And, that's what all of this is about is, creating a dialogue, hopefully an ongoing dialogue. I'm already getting requests for you to come back, Maria. So
anytime,
yeah.
it's an absolute pleasure. It's an honor to be here with all of you. So
yes, we're so happy that you're here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, so if anyone needs any more information, you can screenshot her email if you weren't able to do that. Just contact me and I'll make sure that you get her. Yeah, are there any last questions or anything?
Yeah, Wendy, are you going to send us the link to the recording?
Yes, I will. And my goal is to put it on YouTube. So
okay, just let us know.
Yes, I will do that.
Yeah, please.
But I will
please.
send the recording in the meantime. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I know some folks would be very interested in
Yes, this was really, really amazing.
Yep.
Yeah, so everybody, thank you so, so much. It's great to see all of your beautiful faces. If there are any questions or anything, please contact us. Let us know. If you have anybody that you would like to have for as a presenter, let us know. We are interested in anybody who has information, not just about Black Seminoles, although that's great, but, Black history in general. And who knows, we might even branch out into other areas of interest, depending on what, feedback we get. So, if you have anybody else that you would like for us to have as a presenter, let us know. We'd be happy to have them. So again, thank you so much.
All your messages too. So I'll try to save. I'm not sure how to save all the
things, I just screenshot everything. But you're on a computer, right?
Yes, I'm on a computer, yeah.
So I'll send everybody's email to you.
Yes. And seriously, if anybody has any further questions or just, whatever, just you can always email me, and I'm always very excited to just talk and help you in any way I can. So
yeah.
Good.
Great.
All right, everyone. So thank you again so much. And y'all have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Good night.
Thanks,
Doc.
Thank you, Wendy.
Mr. Al, did you have something to say?
Oh, do a copy. Just do a copy.
Do a copy to get everybody's email?
Of the chat.
Oh yeah. Okay, maybe I can do this.
Yeah, I don't want to end it before you're able to do that.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to save the chat. Chat saved. And then, well, I'm also recording it. So, and then I'll send you the recording. Yeah. Okay. So,
that was very good.
All right, cool. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
All right.
Good night.
Good night.